So I wanted to also just say that, I'm going to say it again, Happy No King's Day. I also have a pacifist, anarchic surprise underneath, like Eric. Get ready, everybody. This really weird t-shirt that I bought on the border of Spain, France, and the Pyrenees. Yeah. We don't know where it was made. Welcome to your nation. Stars in night. Freedom is new generation. I love USA. All right. On that note, we've got Abhijit from India, who is a PhD candidate and English professor, here to talk about mysticism in Henry Miller. And I'll leave it over to you.
Good morning. It's truly an honor to be here. I'm deeply humbled to stand before scholars whose works have guided my research, Professor James Decker, Mary Dearborn, Arthur Hoyle, Roger Jackson, Wayne Arnold, Katie Masoga, and others, people I had only read and admired, and now I finally get to meet all of you. It is through Dearborn I got to know that Miller had a copy of Tantric Yoga on his shelves, something he proudly shared with Brenda Venus, and something that establishes the fact that Miller was deeply familiar with the works of Abhinavagupta and the tantric notion of tapas and spiritualized sexual energy. I'll come back to this in the course of my presentation. My goal today is to talk about what I feel Miller's deep spiritual and philosophical connection to India and Indian knowledge systems, which for far too long has remained unexplored. I would like to briefly talk about my first encounter with Henry Miller, how it all began. Well, in my early years as a reader, I was drawn towards the great tradition of erotic and transgressive literature, as I'm sure most of us have been. I was a man on a mission to unearth every kind of forbidden text, every hidden filth buried under the layers of respectability. My quest took me everywhere, from the obscene erotica of southern India and Tamil texts to the dark underbelly of French literature, from South Asian clandestine writings to the Victorian underground of Britain, where, behind the polished veneer of social decorum and moral superiority, there thrived a shadow world of erotic imagination, secret, transgressive, and alive. And in that quest, I inevitably arrived at Henry Miller. I began reading him expecting precisely that, the erotic, the pornographic, the transgressive. And of course, I found it all there. But to my great surprise, I also found something else, something I had never encountered before. That was the moment I abandoned my earlier research on 19th century erotic fiction and redirected my PhD towards Henry Miller, as advised by my PhD supervisor, who is also here today and will be speaking later. When I reached the Rosy Crucifixion trilogy, everything changed. At a time when the frenzy of avant-garde experimentation had already died down in Europe and American modernisms, Miller was doing something else entirely. He reinvented the semi-autobiographical mode, turning autobiography into anti-literature. He brought back what had been lost in modernism, that raw experiential energy of Emerson, Thoreau, and Whitman, the old American current of mysticism and immediacy, but refracted through the dust, sweat, and flesh of modern life. And very early on, even in Tropic of Cancer, Miller's imagination began to gesture towards the East, towards India. He writes in Nexus, reflecting on his younger self, I was a pretty brute. I was a pretty insensitive brute, as you know. I didn't give a shit about Hindu philosophy then. But as the years pass, that casual dismissal turns into fascination and eventually reverence. In Miller, we see a gradual deepening from the iconoclastic irreverence of Tropic of Cancer to the nuanced, searching reflections on Hinduism and Indian philosophy that surface in the Rosy Crucifixion and his later works. So, my encounter with Miller was not just with a writer of transgression, it was with a seeker wandering through chaos who was, perhaps unknowingly, walking towards India. Thank you. Well, in July 2022, the James Webb Space Telescope captured an image called SMACS 0723, a tiny patch of sky no bigger than a grain of sand held at arm's length, revealing over 45,000 galaxies, each with billions of stars. And the light we see from them began its journey 13.5 billion years ago, almost at the dawn of time. That image is not just a picture, it's time itself unfolding, a glimpse into something so vast that our language falters before it. For a moment, modern science brushed against the eternal. And yet, thousands of years earlier, Indian seers had already imagined such cosmic immensity. They didn't know, they saw. Where the West seeks to measure, India sought to realize. Science sees singularity, Advaita sees Purnam, fullness. Cosmology sees expansion, Vedanta sees unfolding, the divine play of the infinite differentiating itself. We must remember it was only in the 1920s that Edwin Hubble proved the Andromeda Nebula was really something else, another galaxy. We are so late in knowing, and yet India had already seen the whole. This paradox between infinite seeing and limited knowing haunted Henry Miller all his life. He sensed that human knowledge, however great, always falls short before the mystery. And yet he kept trying to approach the mystical not through belief or doctrine, but through experience. And somewhere in that journey, through hunger, chaos, love, and revelation, he took what I call the Indian turn, towards seeing, not knowing, towards being, not having. Yeah, thank you. If we look at this image, the Pashupati seal from the Indus Valley civilization, we see something extraordinary. A figure seated in meditation surrounded by animals, possibly tricephalic, three-headed. This is not religion as we understand it. It reminds us that long before the West invented the word mysticism, India had already developed full philosophical systems of embodiment, Advaita Vedanta, Kashmir Shaivism, Tantra, that sought to understand not God above, but consciousness within. And this is precisely what I mean when I say India had mysticism before mysticism. Mysticism, as Richard King argues, is a Western Christian construct born out of theology, an attempt to define a set of experiences within Christianity as mystical. When colonial scholars later encountered India, they imposed the same framework, reducing Indian adhyatmika jnana, or spiritual knowledge, to a vague image of the mystic East. But Indian thought was never mystical in that sense. It was experiential, methodical, embodied. In Shaivism, for example, the divine is not transcendent but immanent. In Abhinavagupta's Tantra Loka, experience itself is a hierarchy of embodiment. Every vibration of consciousness, every act of perception is sacred. As Gavin Flood comments, the body is an extensible field, a porous boundary where subject and object meet. Mysticism as a continuity, not a rupture. And when we read Miller, we realize that India, for him, is not merely a place, but a state of being. He's intuitively grasping what these Indian systems already knew, that to experience the infinite, one does not ascend, one descends into life. Here we see mysticism in India, especially in Kashmir Shaivism, evolved into one of the most complex and embodied systems of thought anywhere in the world. And it's here, in this vision of embodied consciousness, that Miller's mysticism finds one of its most striking parallels. This line from Plexus that I've quoted here could easily have been written by Abhinavagupta himself, because that's precisely the project of Abhinavagupta, Abhinavagupta's Tantra Loka, to be specific, bridging the gulf between the human and the cosmic through consciousness. Abhinavagupta, writing in the 11th century, produced the most authoritative text of Advaita Tantra, exploring bondage, liberation or moksha, and manifestation, as he does so not through renunciation, but through participation. The world for him is not an illusion to be rejected, it's Shiva's manifestation, shimmering as appearance or abhasa. This theory, Abhasavada, literally means that which appears. Everything that exists, from the densest matter to the subtlest thought, is Shiva appearing to himself. The transcendental and the immanent, Vishvortina and Vishvamaya, are not two separate realms, but two faces of the same reality. That's why in Shaivism, liberation doesn't mean withdrawal. It means recognition. I don't want to confuse it with recognition. It's recognition or pratyabhigyana, the self's recovery of its own divine nature. It's not a journey towards the outwards or inwards, but rather towards a renewal of perception. So in Miller's mystical empiricism, his hunger, his sensuality, his laughter, his suffering, we hear an echo of that Shaivistic pulse, the vibration of consciousness that says nothing is outside the divine. Here are some quotes from and passages where Miller refers to India in the Rosy Crucifixion trilogy. There are a lot of them. It shows a clear appreciation of India in Miller in a nuanced sense, a development or evolution from his tropic days. Next one, please. There's a lot of them. I just had a few to just show you. Yeah. Well, by the time Miller wrote The Air-Conditioned Nightmare, after his return to America, that was a very pivotal moment. What he found disturbed him deeply. He saw a civilization technologically advanced, but spiritually hollow. America to him was air-conditioned, shut off from prana, the vital breath of life. As Mary Dearborn observes, Miller was moving more certainly than ever in the direction of the mystical and the occult. The real nightmare, he realized, was not poverty or chaos, but spiritual sterility. It is in this mood of searching and alienation that Miller discovers India, not as a tourist destination, but as a spiritual alternative. He begins reading Homa Holo's two volumes on Ramakrishna and Vivekananda, and that experience overwhelms him. He says, I had just been reading Holo's book on Vivekananda. I had put it down because I couldn't read anymore. My emotions were so powerful. He recalls being moved to tears by Holo's descriptions of Vivekananda's triumphant return to India. Miller begins to see in Vivekananda what America had lost: strength, vitality, and spiritual courage. So it's a spiritual cartography of sorts, a journey through the wasteland of industrial America, but inwardly a pilgrimage towards India. For Miller, the East offered not dogma, but renewal, a return to the immediacy of being, to the sacredness of experience itself. In a way, Vivekananda becomes Miller's mirror. Both were critics of modernity, both rejected institutionalized religion, and both sought to restore the divine to the human. Miller's mysticism from this point onwards would take a decisive turn towards India, embodied, immanent, and alive. Excerpts from The Air-Conditioned Nightmare. And one of the key influences that helped Miller arrive at this realization was the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna by Mahendranath Gupta, or Srimo, or M as we call him. Miller lists the Gospel among the most important books of his life, mentioning it explicitly in plexus and again in nexus. Ramakrishna, of course, was Swami Vivekananda's guru, the great mystic from Dakshineshwar, whose spiritual practice combined Vedanta, Tantra, and Bhakti into a single living experience. And what Miller seems to have found in him is a mirror of his own spiritual and artistic restlessness. Ramakrishna experimented with multiple paths, meditating on Kali, Christ, and Allah, not to choose between them, but to discover the unity behind all forms. Miller, in his own way, was doing something very similar, trying through writing, through love, through art, through the body itself to reach a state of inner revelation. Ramakrishna's ecstatic states or bhava, those intense moments where the body itself becomes a site of revelation, find a modern, desacralized echo in Miller's euphorias. Those moments in Sextus, Plexus, and Capricorn, where language explodes, where where vision takes over syntax and where the self dissolves into pure feeling. They are his own desacralized versions of samadhi, translated into the vocabulary of art. I want to turn to what I call the desacralization of mysticism, that long philosophical movement that begins in the West with Nietzsche, Bergson, and Desacralizing, and later finds its full expression in Deleuze. Each of these thinkers, in their own way, dismantled the traditional idea of mysticism as transcendence, as an ascent towards some divine elsewhere, and replaced it with a form of immanence, of lived experience of the body as a site of revelation. Nietzsche announces the death of God, stripping mysticism of its theological scaffolding and turning it into a creative existential act. Bergson, of course, then transforms this impulse into what he calls élan vital, the vital flow of life itself, where mystical experience becomes a creative emotion, not a metaphysical revelation. Desacralizing calls it an ecstatic process, a state where mysticism no longer belongs to the church or the monastery, but to the movements of the body, to gesture, to sensations, to language itself. Deleuze gathers all of these strands and pushes them even further. He draws from Spinoza's monism, the belief that everything that exists is a single substance, to propose what he calls the plane of immanence. This turn towards immanence, this desacralization, is precisely what connects Miller to both the Western and Indian traditions. Like Deleuze's body without organs, or Sartre's ecstatic practice, Miller's body becomes his laboratory of revelation. His euphorias, his states of creative frenzy and sensual exhaustion are not symbolic but embodied. And this is where Indian philosophy meets Deleuze halfway. Because in Tantra and Kashmir Shaivism too, mysticism is never about flight from the body. It's about awakening through the body. If there is one idea that truly anchors Miller's vision, it is movement. Not as travel or geography, but as a mystical process, a spiritual method. For Miller, the flaneur is not a detached observer. Of course, a lot has been said about the flaneur and Baudelaire, so I'll just skim through it. For Miller, the flaneur is not a detached observer like Baudelaire's urban stroller. He is a participant, a wanderer whose every step through the city is a step through consciousness. Through wandering, Miller deterritorializes life itself. He becomes what Deleuze and Guattari would call the nomad, an individual no longer bound by fixed identity or destination. That new way of looking is precisely the mystical insight Miller arrives at through movement. The realization that illumination is not something else, but already embedded in the act of going, sensing, and perceiving. The burlesque, particularly, becomes a perfect example of this. It is not a mere theater of eroticism, but a zone of becoming. What Foucault calls a limit experience, a space where identity, morality, and even divinity are suspended and recombined. In this sense, the burlesque is Miller's laboratory of immanence, where body, rhythm, and desire merge in revelation. Well, I would have done a bit of olfactory experiment, but there was a bit of misadventure, so so I'll skip that, but I'll talk about it at any rate. Well, when we talk about mysticism, we often imagine something abstract, cerebral, beyond the body. But Miller's mysticism begins with the body. It begins with the senses, with what Indian philosophy calls the Panchendriyas, the 5 gateways through which the world enters us. For Miller, the most immediate of these smells, Gandha, is his bluntest mystical instrument. The smell of the burlesque house, of camphor, sweat, disinfectant, it's the world entering the body, vibrating through him. It's not just disgust, it's contact. It's matter announcing itself as flesh. And that brings me to something I would have wanted you to experience. Ellen Covey, a very wonderful American perfumer, created a fragrance called Tropic of Capricorn, inspired by this passage. And there she talks about Miller's lines, that frighteningly silent night Miller wrote about, at once incomprehensible and eloquent. The perfume creates an aura of a still humid tropical night, redolent with the scent of exuberant blooming life, quick death, and the almost immediate rebirth that springs out of dead flowers, something sensed at a level below conscious thought. Because a lot has been said about Conrad. Yeah. And, I would like to end my presentation by sharing that during the course of my PhD, I also discovered numerous new perspectives, rich and fascinating ideas that are slightly beyond the scope of my PhD. The first of these ideas is the notion of the fuck state. Many Miller scholars have noted Miller's divided self. I believe that this, through the concept of fuck states, can help us better understand Miller's dissociative narrative voice, his oscillation between Henry and the narrator, between the writer and the wanderer. The second of these ideas is what I call the Mobius narratives, developing the notion of Decker's spiral form and Deleuze's fold into a topological model. Like the Mobius strip, which only has one continuous surface and a single boundary, Miller's prose endlessly folds back on itself. The past becomes the present, the self becomes the other. And finally, something very close to my heart, an exploration of Miller's sensory imagination in dialogue with modern niche perfumery. This will not be a purely theoretical work, but an experiential one. I'm not entirely sure how I'll do it, but I'll try. I want to explore how Miller's olfactory imagination anticipates the molecular and artistic revolutions of niche perfumery in the 21st century. Well, I would like to end here. My goal was to share with you what I feel is Miller's deep spiritual and philosophical connection to India and Indian knowledge systems, which for far too long has remained under-researched and unexplored. Thank you.